In today's GPU benchmark comparison, we are going to be comparing Zotac's newly released RTX 4080 16GB Amp Extreme Airo in white versus the RX 7900 XTX. We've also got three other graphics cards which we'll show in the benchmarks at 1080p, 1440p, and also 4K. However, before we get into the benchmarks, this RTX 4080 in particular is the biggest GPU I have seen around here at Tech Yes City. It measures in at over 350 mil long. It's a triple slot cooler and weighs near 2 kilograms. It also features three 105 mil fans, and we'll get onto the temperatures a little bit later, but basically, if you're thinking about getting an RTX 4080, especially a custom edition, you may have to buy a new case because this thing may simply not fit in a lot of cases. And I was actually a little bit surprised to see when I first got the box. I was like, wow, this card's actually going to be a little bit smaller than I thought, but then when I took it out of the box, the GPU was much bigger than the picture on the box. So this is the first time I've seen this happen in marketing, where usually if you go down to McDonald's, you see the burger on the menu, for example, and that's bigger than what you actually get when you buy the burger. So perhaps when Zotac finished off this model, they may have been scratching their head thinking, perhaps we made this thing a little bit too big. Anyhow, let's look at the results here. We're at 1080p in Modern Warfare 2. We'll start off the benchmarks here. This is where the RX 7900 XTX has an advantage over the RTX 4080. This happens at all resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. And in fact, at 1080p, it's coming in a hair's distance of the RTX 4090. However, switching things over to Apex Legends max settings, here is some good news for both GPUs. They will get the maximum 300 FPS cap in this game, and they'll do so with good 1% and 0.1% lows. And then stepping that up to 1440p, I actually saw the 4080 Amp Extreme edge out the 7900 XTX, and then this continued on to 4K as well. So I heard somewhere on the net that the 7900 XTX was absolutely destroying the 4080 in Apex, but that is not the case. And in fact, I've seen since the RTX 4080's day one release, NVIDIA have actually improved the drivers to deliver more FPS on this title, not only on the 4080, but also on the 4090. Though let's move over to Cyberpunk 2077, where at 1080p, the 7900 XTX edges out the 4080, and this also happens at 1440p. This is on ultra settings, maxing the dial without ray tracing on. However, then at 4K, the 4080 edges out the 7900 XTX. However, I also decided to throw in some ray tracing benchmarks. Here's where the RTX 4080 does have a lead over the 7900 XTX. However, depending on the title, and we'll see this, for instance, in the next title, it's not as big as a margin as it is in Cyberpunk. So let's go over that 4K ray tracing benchmark straight away in F1 2022, where you see it's 61 average FPS versus 51, so not as big as a percentage differential. However, here is where at 1080p and also 1440p, the RTX 4080 does edge out the 7900 XTX, then the 7900 XTX scores a victory at 4K in F1 22. So these results do show you that it's not just the game, but it's also the game and the resolution where these two can score a victory over one another. To move on to Plague Tale Requiem, here's where the RTX 4080 edges out the 7900 XTX ever so slightly across 1080p, 1440p, and also 4K. Then move on to Spider-Man Miles Morales, the latest in the series. Here's where at 1080p, 1440p, and also 4K, the NVIDIA RTX 4080 did score a victory over the RX 7900 XTX. And also when we did the ray tracing benchmarks at 4K Ultra, it did score a victory over the 7900 XTX. But 7900 XTX is showing that AMD is making quite a few strides when it comes to their ray tracing advancements. I actually thought the 4080 would pull ahead by quite a bit more, but the 7900 XTX, at least in Spider-Man and also F1, it's not doing such a bad job with its ray tracing performance. And the last thing to pull up for you guys is the average FPS per dollar. And here is where the RTX 3080 is still coming out on top on NVIDIA's side. And also if you can pick up an RX 6800 XT, especially at those lower than MSRP prices, this is going to come out with the best FPS per dollar on AMD's side of the fence. So these newer cards aren't really geared up towards value for money, which is kind of a shame since they do pack really good power efficiency, especially on the 4080 side of the fence, which will show you those numbers right now. In terms of the RX 7900 XTX, and I'll throw the undervolting numbers up here for both these cards. When I tested this on Ezbench, you can easily, all pun intended, lose about 10% performance for roughly an 80-watt drop from the wall in power consumption. So you can undervolt the RX 7900 XTX and find a sweet spot. It's just you'll be doing so at the cost of roughly 10% performance. As opposed to the RTX 4080, you can get roughly that same 80-watt drop and lose very little performance. So the RTX 4080 does have better power efficiency out of the box, and it also does undervolt quite a bit better, in my opinion, than the 7900 XTX. Now, there's also, I do warn, as we go forward, this card right here, I haven't seen the problem occur yet on this reference model that we got sent over by AMD, but YouTubers like Debarra, for example, they've made some videos that are definitely worth a watch, and I'll put the link up here, where they've found that some of these cards have faulty vapor chambers that can lead to essentially the GPU hitting 110 degrees, and then this slows down performance by up to 10 to 20%. Not only that, running your GPU at 110 degrees is definitely a recipe in the long term, especially for a failed graphics card. So at this point in time, I would actually recommend against getting the reference model for the 7900 XTX. I'd go for a custom partner model card with a different cooler on it than this reference design. However, that issue out of the way, it's time to swing our attention to the RTX 4080 Airo White Edition Amp Extreme from Zotac. This thing, as we said in the intro, it's an absolute chonker of a GPU, and it does perform very well in terms of its temperature, especially its noise, where out of the box it gives out about 30% fan speeds. It is whisper quiet and gives out good temperatures. Then if you up that to 40%, I personally prefer this 40%, drops the temperatures just a little bit, and the noise, just like 30%, is barely noticeable. Then if we up it to 60% and also 80%, that's when the noise does start to creep up very fast, and the temperature drops are there, but they're not worth it, in my opinion, for the trade-off in noise. However, the best thing about all this is if you are in undervolting, you can drop those temperatures down and keep the fan speeds down and your power consumption down and still get really good performance. They're looking at the value add with this card. They've also included a GPU support bracket, which I personally think you are definitely going to need since this thing is so long and heavy. So it's good that they've included that. I'd be personally using this in any build that I did with not just the RTX 4080 from Zotac here, but any RTX 4080. And they've also included a RGB cable if you want to plug that up to your motherboard and use your motherboard's firmware, which differs from Zotac's, for example. And speaking of RGB, there's RGB on the side, back, and front in different areas, and you can control that. And then lastly, there is a dual BIOS, so you can switch between two different BIOSes. Here in today's video, we tested the out-of-the-box numbers, which are a little bit overclocked versus the reference. However, it didn't make too much of a difference in both power consumption and extra FPS. So for what it's worth, the RTX 4080s are all going to perform very similar, especially out of the box. So it's really going to come down to which model you like the best in terms of aesthetics, and of course, if you can stomach that price. Where the RTX 4080s are generally starting from 1200 USD, but this one, at least from what I can research, carries roughly an extra $100 US on the price point. However, in Australia, for example, this thing is only coming in over $100 MSRP Aussie over the baseline model. So if I was in Australia and I was looking for an RTX 4080 and I was willing to stomach that price, I would actually be going for this Zotac Amp Extreme, as well as having the room in the case to fit it. We're in such a weird time in PC gaming where the newer cards that are being released, they're not really value for money plays in really any way, shape, or form, especially compared to the last generation cards and their MSRP. And yes, there has been inflation there, I do get that. However, it seems like the RTX 4080 is just a bit too much cut down from the RTX 4090. I would have liked to have seen this card come in $100 US cheaper and also have a few more CUDA cores enabled, especially versus the 4090. And I think then it would have been a pretty hard-hitting graphics card. At this time, it is still hard-hitting, but it's not in the value segment. And I think the cards are too big as well, so a lot of people will have to buy a new case. Can't fit it in mini ITX builds, for example, it's just too big. So there are a lot of points there to critique with the 4080 in general. However, it is a card that is fast, it is power efficient, and it will give you a good experience at 4K as well as 1440p. I think that's the resolution this card is intended for. But from what it's worth, the Amp Extreme Airo White Edition from Zotac, it's a lot to stomach there in the naming, is a very good implementation of a 4080. Just keep in mind, the size is massive. And with all that out of the way, I hope you guys enjoyed today's graphics card comparison. If you did, be sure to hit that like button for us. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to drop them down below. And if you stayed this far, then be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell to get the content as soon as it drops. And with that aside, we've also got the question of the day here, which comes from user XR3LE6HX7P, and they ask, hello, please help me. I have a card and it seems to be undervolted by the last owner. While playing the game, the power consumption is 50 watts, and the GPU consumption between 20 and 50%, and CPU 90%. How do I reset the card to normal mode? So this question, I don't think the card is undervolted out of the box. I mean, if it is, then it's not the GPU that's giving you the FPS problem right now. Your CPU running at 90% means your CPU bottlenecked. So I'd look to alleviate that. And in particular, an easy way to check if your GPU is running out of the norm is just run a simple benchmark like Firestrike or even Unigine Heaven, and then get that score on max settings ultra with MSAA maxed out and compare that to what others have online. And then you'll find out, because what I'm seeing there is just more a CPU bottleneck. Though if you do want to flash the card, I do have a guide up here where I do flash the card and change the BIOS. It does only work on older cards, however, so if you've got an RTX 4000 or 3000 series graphics card, then you unfortunately can't flash that BIOS to a different BIOS. Hope that answers that question, and I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.